Hello and welcome to another video on my series on mental illness. Some of the symptoms of psychosis include delusions, irrational behaviour, paranoia and hallucinations, including audible hearing voices, visual seeing things that aren't there, and also tactile hallucinations, feeling things that aren't real. But today I'm going to talk about audible hallucinations from the sufferer's point of view. I first started hearing voices after my first initial admission to hospital in 1984. It started out as a background buzz, a bit like when you go to a public event, like a dinner or a theatre or something before the play starts, and you have the buzz of the audience talking to each other, and you can't quite make anything out as to exactly what is being said. Well, that started out as a background buzz. Out of the blue, the voices became clear as a bell. It was just like talking to somebody face to face. Well, you can't see them. Or talking to somebody on the telephone, but there'd be no telephone there, no telephone wire or anything. Well, I wasn't just hearing things. I started actually having mental conversations in my head. And I decided to call it telepathic communication. And I said, just like being on the phone, but done in your head. Now, as a physics student, and at the time of my admission in '84, I was a third-year student in my final year in a degree of physics, I made quite a good attempt to actually explain how all this was working and how it could be possible by the use of wave mechanics, something I'd learnt during my degree. And those poor nurses on the ward were totally and utterly bemused. I expect if they sat in any of our theoretical physics lectures, they will probably go and get the men and have us all thrown into lunatic asylums for some of the things that we were taught and learnt in theoretical physics. It's just mind-blowing even to me, and I have a degree in physics. But one doctor, indeed, he knew enough physics to actually understand my theory. He didn't think I was right, but he could understand where I was coming from. Now, these telepathic conversations then started to give rise to other psychotic symptoms that were noted by the staff, such as delusions, things that I'd taken for granted, say Earth being round, Earth revolving around the sun, and various stuff like that, just went completely haywire. I just thought that everything that I'd thought and taken for granted was wrong. I started getting paranoid, behaving irrationally. And that was a result of hearing the voices in my head. Now, they started off as banter and witty exchanges and was actually, for the first day or two, quite fun. Soon, it turned not very pleasant. These voices started to accuse me of various stuff, some of which was true, some of which was going back to early childhood, but most of it was just made up lies. And these voices, they went and turned religious. For example, telling me that the hospital was really hell, and the only way you are going to get out of hell is to escape. So you had to escape from the hospital to a safe house. And as I resisted these voices, they got more and more aggressive and threatening. And as the days rolled on, it became more and more obvious to me that they were lying to me. You see, they became a bit like the good cop, bad cop scenario. You'd have the aggressive ones who were threatening and just trying to intimidate me, with the nice voices that would start telling jokes and reminiscing. And there were very major religious overtones. In fact, the voices concluded that everybody was hating me, that I was the most hated person in the world, not because I was evil, but because I was the Messiah. Would you believe that? Anybody who knows me would say quite clearly I am not the Messiah. And then they determined that I'd lied about my interpretation of the scriptures. And as I was now a liar, I'd gone from Messiah to Antichrist. And that was why everybody hated me. I remember, after about a month of this, one day, suddenly the voices were accusing me of being the devil himself. Well, then a new voice appeared and denounced the original one, calling it the devil. And then the two voices started calling each other the devil. The volume diminished until it became silent. And that was it. Audible hallucinations in that first psychotic episode had disappeared. One major thing happened to me in that hospital in 1984, which has changed my life, so much for the better, when I became a Christian and found Jesus Christ and gave my life over to him. Unfortunately, as I'd gone back to university in 1985 to complete my degree, I found myself back in the hospital again. Well, this time there were various voices I was hearing, mostly though the pastor of my church. Some of these other voices were family and friends. Others were famous people. For example, President Reagan. That was one person that I could hear in my head. Well, then I was able to recognise familiar patterns coming up. Telepathic conversations, religious teaching. When I didn't do as I was told, they got aggressive. I could tell they were lying. But this time now, when they started talking about religious and spiritual things, I was getting enough teaching to be able to counter some of the false religious teachings that these voices were giving me by being able to quote from the scriptures. And the voice of my pastor was absolutely amazed at how I was able to prove him wrong. And he tried to puff me up by getting me to feel proud and superior with my knowledge, even saying that he was going to get me out of the hospital and I'd be preaching the sermon on Sunday morning instead of him. Well, that might have been sort of semi-prophetic. It wasn't the Lord speaking at the time there. But 3.5 years later, I actually started training to become a lay preacher and still do preach even to this day. So observations that are made about audible hallucinations. For me, they were clear as a bell. It was just like talking to somebody face to face, but with nobody being there. They very quickly turned ugly and aggressive, and in inverted commas, had to be obeyed. They knew where I was and what was going on around me, despite being miles away. For example, I was walking down London Road in Nottingham, and his voice was the pastor. He was back at his manse, miles away, and suddenly shouted at me, "There's a van about half a mile down the road heading in your direction. It contains 5 thugs with baseball bats who are going to jump out and beat you. Listen, turn left at the next intersection, walk down that road to throw them off the scent." It never occurred to me at the time to ask the question, how do you know? You're miles away. How do you know what's going on the road I'm walking on? Well, a good question. How does it know? Because it wasn't telling me the truth. I also had ridiculous scenarios, and with my sense of humour, I do tend to like the ridiculous. So things like being on a guest appearance that I made on a magic show on TV while I was actually in my room on the ward, and making a guest appearance on a light entertainment show on a Saturday evening on BBC television. What they'd done, according to these voices inside my head, had made a robot that looked like me, and that somehow they'd managed to get it in sync with my mind, so that everything I thought and said and did, it did. And that sort of scenario, well, thinking about it, it could make a very good comedy sketch, and it was amusing. At that time when I was making up the commentary to an international football match that was going to be played later that evening. And you know, when you're thinking things inside your head, you can hear your own voice. On that occasion, while I was making up the commentary and thinking, the voice in my head wasn't mine, but it was the BBC Radio's football commentator, Peter Jones. And I was making up the commentary, and as far as I was concerned at the time, it was being broadcast live over the radio. And I had the feeling, well, just to make people think that know that things weren't quite right where I was making up strange scenarios, like one team playing in all green. The ball was green, so all they could see was white England players running around the pitch, and they were just making everything else up. Once again, could be a good comedy series or sketch, but it turned out that wasn't being broadcast over the radio. I say thank goodness. But for me, these voices came and went very, very suddenly. There were a few nice exchanges, a few amusing scenarios, but the majority of the time it was ugly and gave rise to other psychotic symptoms such as paranoia, acute anxiety, delusions. Also contained many religious overtones. But as I look back and could even fathom at the time, the vast majority of what was being said was just a total pack of lies. And the hold that they had upon me was broken, I found, when I could recognise that what they were saying was not true, and was then able to reject them. But that took rather a lot of time, but I got there. And these psychotic symptoms are interrelated. They're forming a bit of a vicious circle that you can go round and round, and as you gain speed in angular momentum, these circles can get bigger and bigger and bigger. But breaking one of the symptoms can actually do an awful lot of good for the patient and lead to a reasonably speedy recovery from that episode. And in my next video, I'll be talking about the connections between symptoms such as anxiety, paranoid hallucinations, and how we can break the cycle, and how people who've not suffered can help to break the cycle of somebody who is in a psychotic situation.